My husband of 50 years was gone, and my daughter-in-law, Charlotte, couldn't have been happier. She leaned over to me right after the funeral, a cruel little smile on her lips, and told me to prepare myself for a lonely, simple life. She sat all smiles at the will reading, certain she'd inherited my husband's $50 million fortune. She was right. For about 5 minutes. Then the lawyer put the papers down, looked her dead in the eye, and laughed. My name is Evelyn Prescott, and this is the story of how I was given the power to completely dismantle the life of the woman who tried to destroy my family. To follow my journey and see how I turn my grief into cold, calculated revenge, make sure you subscribe and click that notification bell. Like this story if you're ready to see her get what she deserves, and let me know in the comments. What would be your first move? The scent of white lilies was suffocating. For 50 years, Richard had filled our home with them, a weekly tradition that had become as much a part of our life as breathing. Now, their funereal perfume filled the cavernous space of St. James Cathedral, a cloying reminder that he was gone. I sat in the front pew, a black veil doing little to hide the tremor in my hands. Grief was a hollow, echoing thing, a vast emptiness where a life once was. Then, a perfectly manicured hand rested on my shoulder. "Evelyn, you're holding up so well." I looked up into the face of my daughter-in-law, Charlotte. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were filled with a carefully practiced sympathy. Her dress was a masterpiece of somber couture, expensive and just respectful enough. She was a work of art, beautiful and entirely artificial. "We have to be strong now," she whispered, her voice a silken thread of false comfort. She squeezed my shoulder, her grip a little too tight, a little too possessive. My son Mark stood a step behind her, looking lost. He was a ghost in his own father's story, his eyes avoiding mine. "Mom," he mumbled, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. He hadn't called me that with any real warmth since Charlotte sank her claws into him 5 years ago. He used to be a boy with a booming laugh and a fierce love for his father. Now he was a shadow, tailored and managed by the woman who stood beside him like a puppeteer. "Richard is in a better place," Charlotte continued, her gaze sweeping over the opulent church, the powerful people filling the pews, senators, CEOs, philanthropists. She wasn't seeing a memorial, she was seeing a network, an inventory. I simply nodded, my throat too tight for words. I felt her veiled threat hanging in the air between us. The life Richard and I had built, the legacy, the fortune. She saw it all as her own now. And she believed I, the grieving widow, was nothing more than a sentimental relic to be managed and, eventually, discarded. 2 days later, the 5 of us, me, Mark, Charlotte and Richard's 2 lawyers, were seated in the polished mahogany conference room of Abernathy and Sons. The air was thick with tension and the smell of old leather. Charlotte, however, seemed to be breathing a different, more rarefied air. She was electric with anticipation. She sat beside Mark, her hand resting proprietarily on his thigh. She'd traded her somber black for a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit that screamed quiet luxury. Every few moments, she would lean in and whisper something in Mark's ear, then glance at me, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She thought this was her coronation. Mr. Abernathy, a man with a kind, craggy face who had been Richard's friend and counsel for 40 years, cleared his throat. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the thick document in his hands. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The preliminary bequests were as expected: donations to the Met, to his alma mater, a generous gift to our longtime housekeeper. Charlotte listened with polite impatience. Then Abernathy arrived at the main clause. "And as to the remainder of my estate, including all properties, liquid assets, and controlling shares in Prescott Enterprises, valued at approximately $50 million. He paused, and in that silence, I saw Charlotte's smile widen. She squeezed Mark's leg. This was it. "I bequeath in its entirety to my beloved and only son, Mark Prescott." The words landed like a physical blow. The air rushed from my lungs. I kept my expression a placid mask, a skill honed over decades of corporate dinners and society functions, but inside I felt the ground crumble. Charlotte's smile was no longer smug. It was blindingly triumphant. She looked directly at me, her eyes glinting with a victory so complete, so absolute, it was almost pitying. She had won. Just as she'd told me she would. Mr. Abernathy shuffled the main pages of the will to the side. Mark was trying to look solemn, but Charlotte's victorious energy was infectious. She was already mentally redecorating our Hamptons estate. I was sure of it. The lawyer was about to speak, to offer his official condolences and conclude the meeting. But he stopped. He looked down at the polished table, then looked up at Mark and Charlotte. A strange expression crossed his face. He put the papers down. And then he laughed. It wasn't a loud, booming laugh. It was a soft, dry chuckle, a private sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Charlotte's triumphant expression froze. Mark looked utterly bewildered. "I believe," Mr. Abernathy said, his eyes twinkling, "we have one final item." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single separate sheet of paper, sealed with wax bearing Richard's personal signet ring. "A codicil," he announced to the silent room. "Drafted, signed, and witnessed 3 months ago. Legally, it supersedes the clause we just discussed." He broke the seal. Charlotte leaned forward, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. Mr. Abernathy read with slow, deliberate precision. "Notwithstanding any previous declarations, it is my final and absolute will that the entirety of my $50 million estate be placed into a private entity known as the Prescott Legacy Trust." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the final, devastating blow. "The sole executor and trustee of this trust, with absolute and indisputable authority over the management and distribution of all funds, shall be my beloved wife, Evelyn Prescott." Silence. The clock on the wall seemed to tick with the force of a hammer. I felt a jolt, a current of electricity that shot through the fog of my grief. I looked from the codicil in Abernathy's hand to Charlotte. Her face had collapsed. The smugness, the triumph, the condescending pity. It all melted away, replaced by a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her mouth was a thin white line. Her eyes, fixed on me, were burning with a hatred so potent it was practically a physical force. The lawyer hadn't just put the papers down. He had just detonated a bomb, and I was the one left holding the trigger. "This is outrageous." Charlotte's voice was a shrill crack in the stunned silence. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "It's a trick." He was not of sound mind. "We'll fight this, I swear to God we will." Mr. Abernathy didn't flinch. He simply looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "I assure you, Mrs. Prescott," he said, his tone as solid as the mahogany table, "Richard was perfectly sound of mind. We have doctors' affidavits to that effect. This codicil is ironclad. It is his final word." Mark, pale and shaken, finally spoke. "But what does this mean? For me?" Abernathy's gaze softened slightly as he turned to my son. "It means," he said calmly, "that your mother is in control of the family finances. She will determine how the trust's assets are managed and distributed, including any allowance you may receive." Charlotte let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a hiss. She stared at me, her mind clearly racing, processing the total inversion of power that had just occurred. A few minutes ago I was a relic. Now I was her gatekeeper. They did try to fight it. Their lawyers sent letters, filed motions. But it was a futile, expensive gesture. Richard and Abernathy had constructed a fortress, and I was now its queen. Each legal challenge was calmly and systematically dismantled. Walking out of that office, the cool city air felt different on my skin. The grief for Richard was still a heavy cloak, but it was now threaded with something else. Purpose. He hadn't disinherited his son. I realized that with a clarity that was both heartbreaking and empowering. He had seen the predator at his son's side, and he had given me the weapon to protect our family. This wasn't a punishment for Mark. It was a final, desperate act of love. Final gift to me. And as I stepped into the waiting car, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would not fail him. The first request came 3 days later, via an email from Charlotte to Mr. Abernathy's office, which was promptly forwarded to me. It was a funds transfer request for $250,000 to cover their monthly household expenses and social obligations. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I sat at Richard's old desk in his home study, the scent of his pipe tobacco still faintly clinging to the leather chair. I looked at their request, then at the detailed financial report I'd had Abernathy's office compile. It showed a history of astonishing waste. $30,000 a month on clothes, thousands on restaurants I'd never heard of, a lease on a new Maserati for Charlotte that was more than most people's mortgages. I typed out a calm, concise reply. I authorized a transfer of $15,000. Enough to cover the mortgage on their condo, their utilities and groceries. Nothing more. My phone rang less than an hour later. It was Mark. "Mom, did you see the email?" "There must be a mistake," he began, his voice tight with an anxiety I knew was being fueled by the furious woman standing next to him. "There's no mistake, Mark," I said, my voice even. "That is your allowance for the month. $15,000. We can't live on that. Charlotte has. We have commitments." "Then I suggest you and Charlotte learn to live within a budget," I replied coolly. "Your father's money is no longer a personal slush fund. It is a legacy. And I am its guardian." I could hear Charlotte shrieking in the background before Mark hastily ended the call. That small act was the first stone cast in a very still pond. The ripples were immediate. In the following weeks, I began the quiet work of untangling our lives from theirs. I reconnected with old friends for lunch, women who Charlotte had deemed stuffy and had pushed out of our lives. They were loyal to Richard's memory and wary of his daughter-in-law. One of them, a board member at the New York City Ballet, told me how Charlotte had tried to leverage the Prescott name for a seat she hadn't earned. I was gathering intelligence. I was building alliances. I was no longer a grieving widow, waiting for the end. I was a woman with a $50 million war chest and a very clear mission. The game had just begun, and for the first time I was ready to play. My first real offensive was silent, executed with nothing more than a pen and a checkbook. The annual autumn gala for the Children's Literacy Fund was the crown jewel of the fall social season, a place where fortunes were flaunted under the guise of philanthropy. For the past 4 years, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Prescott had chaired a table, a $50,000 donation that bought them prestige and Charlotte a platform to show off a new couture gown. A week before the event, I received a call from Mark. "Mom, I assume the check for the gala is on its way?" he asked, a forced casualness in his tone. "Charlotte is having her final dress fitting." "I haven't sent a check, Mark," I replied, examining my own neatly written signature on a different envelope. "What?" "Mom, we're table chairs. It's expected." "The Prescott Legacy Trust," I said, my voice serene, "has already made its primary philanthropic donation for the season. A significant one, in fact, to the city's public housing initiative." I let that sink in. The public housing initiative was a worthy, gritty cause that Charlotte had once publicly described at a luncheon as hopelessly unglamorous. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. I could picture the scene perfectly. Mark's panicked expression, Charlotte's face turning to thunder. They didn't go to the gala. Their absence was noted by everyone. Instead, the society pages buzzed with news of the Prescott Trust's generous and refreshingly unshowy contribution to the city's needy. I was no longer just Evelyn Prescott, the widow. I was becoming Evelyn Prescott, the quiet philanthropist. And Charlotte was becoming nothing. I continued this pattern. The Aspen ski trip they took every winter. The trust's funds were unfortunately tied up supporting a soup kitchen in the Bronx. The art auction where Charlotte loved to be seen raising her paddle. I had already committed those funds to a scholarship for underprivileged art students. I was systematically starving her of the oxygen of public prestige, and she was suffocating. The financial pressure acted like a corrosive acid on the already fragile foundation of their marriage. Their united front, once so impenetrable, began to show hairline cracks. I knew this because Mark started calling me. The calls were always when Charlotte was out. He wouldn't complain about her directly, not at first. He'd talk about stress and pressure. "I just don't understand why things have to be so difficult," he vented one afternoon, his voice strained. "We had to sell the Maserati." Charlotte was in tears for a day. She said her friends are all asking questions. "Perhaps her friends are not true friends then," I said calmly, pruning the roses in my garden. "She says I should be a man, that I should stand up to you," he blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush of frustration. "She doesn't understand. It's Dad's will." "Yes, Mark. It is," I said softly. The arguments grew. I'd hear snippets when I called to ask about my grandchildren. Charlotte's sharp, accusatory tone in the background, Mark's weary, defensive replies. The united we of their conversations was slowly being replaced by a fractured you and I. He was caught in a vice, and for the first time, he seemed to be realizing that my hand on the lever was far more patient and unyielding than his wife's hysterical demands. The pressure wasn't just on their finances. It was on their loyalty to each other. And I knew whose loyalty was more brittle. It was time to move beyond finances. I needed to understand who, exactly, my son had married. Mr. Abernathy provided me with the name of a private investigator, a man named Mr. Stone who was discreet, thorough, and utterly invisible. "Just give me a baseline," I told him in his nondescript downtown office. "Education, family, past relationships." 2 weeks later, a thick manila envelope landed on my desk. The contents made my blood run cold. Charlotte's life was a carefully constructed fiction. The old money family from Connecticut. They were a middle-class family from Ohio who had been estranged from their daughter for a decade. The art history degree from a prestigious Swiss university. She had attended for 1 semester before dropping out. But the most damning part was the pattern. Mr. Stone had uncovered 2 prior serious relationships. Both were with significantly older, wealthy men. The first ended when the man's family threatened to contest her influence and disinherit him. The second ended with the man's sudden death from a heart attack, after which Charlotte had engaged in a nasty, but ultimately failed legal battle with his children over his estate. She wasn't just a gold digger. She was a professional. A predator who isolated her targets from their families and then attempted to seize their assets. My son wasn't her first victim, just her most lucrative target. The report didn't fill me with rage. It filled me with a chilling resolve. This wasn't a family squabble. This was an extraction. Armed with this new knowledge, I decided it was time to make my move. I invited Mark to lunch. Not at a fancy restaurant, but in my own home, in the sun-drenched breakfast nook where he used to do his homework as a boy. I served him the roast chicken he'd always loved. He looked tired. There were new lines of stress around his eyes. He picked at his food, the silence between us heavy. "You're not happy, Mark," I said, not as a question but as a statement. He put his fork down and looked at me. His eyes filled with a misery that was profound. "She's difficult." "I know." I let him sit with that for a moment. Then I slid a business proposal across the table. It was a clean energy startup, a sector Richard had always believed in, one that needed seed funding. "I've been looking at this company," I said. "It's a solid investment. It has the potential to be very successful. But it needs a leader. Someone to run it." He looked at the papers, confused. "What does this have to do with me?" "The Prescott Legacy Trust is prepared to invest $10 million, I said, my voice steady. "On one condition. You are appointed CEO. You run the entire operation." Paused, meeting his gaze. "And Charlotte has nothing to do with it. Her name is not on a single document. She does not attend a single meeting. This is yours, and yours alone." I had just offered him a lifeline. It was a chance to build something real, to reclaim his purpose and his self-respect. But it was also a choice. It was a declaration of independence I wasn't sure he had the courage to make. It was a calculated gamble, and the future of our family was the wager. Mark stared at the proposal for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. I saw a storm of emotions in his face. Fear, disbelief, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years, ambition. He was thinking of the endless arguments, the constant pressure from Charlotte, the hollowness of his life. He was thinking of the man he used to be. "She'll never agree," he whispered almost to himself. "This isn't her decision to make, Mark," I said gently. "It's yours. It's your chance to be your own man again. The man your father always knew you could be." He looked up from the papers and his eyes met mine. For the first time, he wasn't looking at me as his wife's adversary, but as his mother. He straightened his shoulders, a subtle but significant shift. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll do it." It was the single most important word he had spoken in 5 years. It was the first crack in the foundation of Charlotte's empire. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. I can only imagine the firestorm that erupted in their condo that night. But the next day, it was not Charlotte who called me to scream. It was Mark who called to accept the position formally. He sounded exhausted but also resolute. He had weathered the storm. He had chosen a side. A deep wedge had been driven between them. He now had a purpose, a project, a world that was entirely his, funded by my trust. It was a world where Charlotte had no power and no influence. She could no longer be his manager, only the angry wife of a man who was finally starting to slip from her grasp. My quiet war had entered a new phase. I now had an ally, however tentative, on the inside. The first few weeks of Mark's new venture were a revelation. We met not in a sterile boardroom, but at the sprawling industrial park he was revitalizing, the air thick with a smell of fresh paint and possibility. He wore a hard hat more often than a designer suit, his sleeves rolled up, his face energized in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager building go-karts in our garage. He was a natural leader, decisive and innovative. It was as if a dormant part of his soul, the part that was all Richard, had finally been awakened. During one of our weekly progress meetings, while reviewing blueprints, he looked up at me. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice quiet. "For everything. For letting her get between us. See it now. What Dad was trying to do. He never stopped loving you, Mark," I told him, my heart aching with a bittersweet mix of sorrow and pride. "He was just trying to save you." "You both did," he admitted, his gaze steady and clear. An unspoken truce settled between us, solidifying into a true alliance. He began to talk more freely, sharing small details about his life with Charlotte. He told me about her private investment accounts he was never allowed to see, her mysterious trips to the Cayman Islands. He was no longer just my son. He was my partner in this fight. He was coming home. With Mark now on my side, our investigation gained a powerful new edge. He knew Charlotte's habits, her secrets, her hiding places. He remembered a second laptop she kept, one she'd always claimed was for a writing project, and was strictly off-limits. On a day he knew she'd be out for hours, he let my investigator, Mr. Stone, into their condo. What Stone found on that laptop was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It contained spreadsheets detailing her systematic siphoning of money from their joint accounts into an offshore entity under her maiden name. There were emails to a wealth manager in Grand Cayman discussing strategies for asset protection in the event of a sudden dissolution of marriage. But the worst was the correspondence with her sister. In a series of shockingly candid messages, Charlotte laid out her entire plan, from her first meeting with Mark to her strategy for managing me after Richard's death. She called me the old dragon who needed to be put out to pasture. She wrote about how, once the full inheritance was in her control, she would convince Mark to give her power of attorney, citing his history of financial stress. Mr. Stone compiled everything into a pristine, damning report. Reading it, I felt a cold, hard certainty. This was the end. We had her. We decided to confront her on our own territory. Richard's study, the heart of our family home. When she arrived with Mark, she must have thought it was another attempt at a family reconciliation. She walked in with a strained, placating smile on her face. "Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm so glad we can finally sit down and talk." "There will be very little talking, Charlotte," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Mark stood beside my chair, a silent, solid presence. I slid a file folder across the polished desk. "This is a divorce settlement. It's quite generous, all things considered. It will allow you to live comfortably. You will sign it, you will leave Mark's life, and you will never contact this family again." Her smile faltered as she opened the folder. She saw the legal papers and scoffed. "You can't be serious. I would never." "Then perhaps you should look at the second folder," Mark said, his voice hard as flint. He pushed another, thicker file towards her. It was Mr. Stone's report. She opened it. I watched as the color drained from her face. She saw the bank statements from the Caymans, the property deeds, the printouts of her own treacherous words. Her mask of civility shattered, revealing the snarling creature beneath. "You had me investigated," she spat, her eyes darting between me and the son she could no longer control. "We did," I said. "Sign the papers, Charlotte. Or this report goes to the district attorney's office. Fraud, wire fraud. I'm sure they'll find it very interesting." For a moment, she looked utterly defeated. Then a cunning, desperate light sparked in her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, a cruel smirk twisting her lips. "You think you have me," she said, her voice low and venomous. "But you've forgotten something. I do my own research too. What do you think the board of Prescott Enterprises would say if they found out their sainted founder, Richard Prescott, started his company with money from a mafia loan shark back in the 70s? What would that do to your precious legacy?" My heart seized. It was true. It was a dark chapter from Richard's desperate early days, a mistake he had spent his entire life atoning for. It was our deepest, most buried secret. But as I looked at Charlotte's triumphant face, I felt no fear. Only a profound pity for her. Richard had prepared me for this too. I held her gaze and didn't flinch. "He told me about that on our third date, Charlotte," I said quietly. "He told me every ugly detail. He didn't want any secrets between us." I leaned forward slightly. "And what he also told me was that he paid the loan back in full within a year, at triple the interest, and then anonymously gave the FBI the tip that dismantled their entire operation. To the world, he would be a man who made a youthful mistake and then courageously rectified it. To you, it is just another weapon that has failed. You have nothing." The collapse was total. The failure of her final gambit broke something inside her. Her face crumpled, the rage and cunning replaced by a raw, pathetic desperation. "You can't do this," she stammered, looking at Mark, her voice cracking. "Mark, baby, tell her. Tell her you love me. We can work this out." Mark looked at the woman he had once loved, his expression a mixture of pity and revulsion. "No, Charlotte," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "We can't. It's over." That was the final blow. She erupted, not in strategic rage, but in a messy, sputtering tantrum, hurling insults, threats, and finally pathetic pleas. It was the undignified end of a long and calculated campaign. Mark and I sat in silence, letting the storm break and exhaust itself. When she was finished, her chest heaving, tears of self-pity streaming down her face, I pushed the divorce papers and a pen across the desk once more. "Sign them," I said. Defeated, stripped of all her weapons and all her dignity, she picked up the pen. Her signature was a spiky, angry scrawl. She threw the pen down, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the study, out of the house, and out of our lives forever. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, and in the ringing silence, Mark and I shared a look not of triumph, but of profound, weary relief. The war was over. The legacy was safe. In the quiet aftermath of Charlotte's departure, a new, gentler rhythm began to settle over our lives. The silence she left behind wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Mark and I began to have dinner once a week, a tradition we hadn't observed in years. At first, our conversations were stilted, carefully navigating the crater she had left in our family. But slowly, tentatively, we began to fill it in. We talked about his business, which was thriving under his focused leadership. He had a genuine passion for it, an echo of Richard's own entrepreneurial fire. We worked together on the trust, reviewing proposals for charitable grants. He had a keen eye for worthy causes, often championing smaller community-based projects that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. We were no longer a general and her soldier fighting a war. We were partners, rebuilding an empire on a new foundation of honesty and mutual respect. We were healing, not by ignoring the scars, but by acknowledging them and building something stronger in their place. One evening, as we were leaving a restaurant, he held the door for me and smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "It's good to have you back, Mom," he said. Or, he corrected himself, "It's good to be back." One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the divorce was finalized, Mark came to visit me in the garden. I was tending to Richard's roses, their late-season blooms a testament to resilience. He stood silently beside me for a long while, watching as I snipped away a withered leaf. "I read all of it," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "The investigator's report. All of Charlotte's emails. I made myself read every word." He turned to face me, and I saw the profound weight of his regret in his eyes. "It wasn't just that I was a fool, Mom. I was weak. I let her poison everything. I let her hurt you, and I stood by and did nothing. I was so desperate for her approval that I was willing to trade my own family for it. I am so sorry for the pain I caused you." Tears welled in his eyes, and in that moment, he was not the CEO of a successful company, but my son, lost and full of remorse. I put down my shears and took his hand. It was the same hand I had held when he'd learned to walk, the hand I'd bandaged after he'd fallen from his bike. "The most important thing you can build, Mark," I said softly, "is a life you can be proud of. And you are doing that now. That is all the apology I will ever need." Forgiveness settled between us, light and clean as the autumn air, and the last of the shadows finally receded. Time began to move forward again. My grandchildren, who had been confused and withdrawn during their parents' toxic final years together, began to flourish under Mark's more present and stable parenting. I made it my mission to connect with them, to ensure they understood what our family name truly stood for. One Saturday I took my granddaughter, 14-year-old Lily, to the Museum of Modern Art. We stood before a striking new installation in a wing I knew had been funded by the Prescott Trust. "Grandma," she asked, "is it true that Mommy, that she only wanted Grandpa Richard's money?" I chose my words carefully. "Sometimes, Lily," I said, "people get confused. They think that money is the prize. But the money is just a tool. It's like a hammer. You can use it to build a beautiful house, or you can use it to break things. The prize is getting to be the person who builds the beautiful house." She looked from the artwork to me, her young face thoughtful. "You built this," she said, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. "You and Grandpa Mark are building things." "That's right, darling," I smiled. "That is the family business." Years later, I sat on the stone bench in my garden, the late afternoon sun warming my face. I was grayer, my movements slower, but my heart was at peace. Mark's company had become a leader in green technology. My grandchildren were thriving, one in medical school, the other studying architecture. Our name was now associated not with scandal or opulence, but with innovation, integrity, and philanthropy. My revenge on Charlotte was complete, but it hadn't been the fiery, destructive inferno I might have once imagined. It was a quiet, patient, and constructive victory. I hadn't destroyed her. I had simply outlasted her. I had protected my husband's legacy by strengthening it, by washing it clean of her greed and ensuring it was rooted in the values Richard and I had cherished. The triumph wasn't in her defeat. It was in the laughter of my grandchildren, in the pride I saw on my son's face, in the enduring peace of this garden. It was the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. On a bright Tuesday morning, I sat once more in the mahogany conference room of Abernathy and Sons. Mr. Abernathy had long since retired. I was now meeting with his son, a man with his father's kind eyes. I was here to make one final amendment to the Prescott Legacy Trust. You see, I explained to the young lawyer, my husband didn't want to just give our family a fortune. He wanted to give them a foundation. My final instructions were clear. My grandchildren would not inherit a lump sum of cash. Instead, the trust would act as a partner in their lives. It would match dollar for dollar any income they earn themselves. It would pay off their student loans upon graduation. It would contribute double to any registered charity they donated to. It would provide the seed money for any business they wished to start, provided they presented a sound and ethical plan. It was not an inheritance of wealth, but an inheritance of purpose. It was a tool designed to empower them, to encourage their ambition, and to reward their compassion. As I signed the final document, my hand steady, I thought of Richard. I thought of his booming laugh and the unwavering faith he'd placed in me. And I thought of the smirking girl at the will reading all those years ago, who had said I'd get nothing. She was right in a way. I hadn't gotten the money. I had been given something far more valuable. The chance to define what it meant. I had been given our legacy. And now, finally, my work was done. And so, the House of Prescott was rebuilt. Not on money, but on principle. In the end, I chose to build a legacy rather than simply savor a victory. But now I leave the final moral question to you. Was I right to forgive my son and use the fortune to guide my family toward a better future? Or, after all the pain and deceit, should I have chosen pure, absolute revenge? And invoked the ultimate clause to dissolve the entire $50 million trust, giving every last cent to charity just to wipe the slate completely clean? You have to choose one. Comment, legacy, if you agree with my path, or comment, revenge, if you believe I should have burned it all to the ground. Thank you for following my story. I'll be reading every single one of your opinions.